And we are live. Hi, everyone. I am Sonia from WorkSafe Tasmania, and I will be your moderator today. Today's session is an introduction to moral injury presented by Dean Yates. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea, and sky. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture, and Aboriginal rights. Please now take a moment to read the following slide about information that you'll receive today. Use the chat tab to type any questions that you might have towards your right-hand side. Those questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Only presenter webcams will be used. And today's presentation is also being recorded and will be available on WorkSafe Tasmania's YouTube channel towards the end of the month. Now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce your presenter, Dean Yates, who's the author of critically acclaimed memoir, Line in the Sand. Dean is also a former Reuters bureau chief who covered some of the world's most traumatic events. After leading Reuters' first global mental health strategy, he went on to run a workplace mental health consultancy and speak publicly about trauma and recovery. Dean played a key role in Tasmania's landmark legislation recognizing PTSD as a presumptive workplace illness and was featured on ABC's Australian Story in 2023. He's now also a facilitator and trainer with Positive Solutions. Welcome to the webinar, Dean. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sonia. I'm absolutely delighted to be giving this presentation for WorkSafe Month 2025, an introduction to moral injury. Some of the material in this presentation may be confronting, so please exercise care and take a break if necessary. More than 250 people registered for this event, which is incredible, and I think just underscores the interest in moral injury. Now, I'm not a clinician, but I feel very comfortable talking about moral injury because I've spent considerable time over the past 10 years understanding my own moral injury and how moral injury fits into the larger trauma context. A very quick work history. I joined Reuters, the world's biggest multimedia news agency in Jakarta in 1993. I reported on the Bali bombings. I covered the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia's Aceh province. 166,000 people were killed in 20 minutes. I was based in Jerusalem in 2006. I covered Israel's war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I was the Reuters bureau chief in Iraq from 2007 to 2008, responsible for 100 people. Two of my Iraqi staff, Namir Noor Eldin and Sayed Chum, were killed in Baghdad on July 12, 2007 in a US gunship attack. My final role at Reuters was head of journalist mental health and well-being. I created a mental health strategy for the company's 2,500 journalists around the world. While still working for Reuters, I relocated back to Tasmania in 2013 with my family, editing stories from my home in Avondale. I was diagnosed with PTSD in early 2016. At one point, I became suicidal. Deeply concerned, my wife Mary insisted I go to the mainland for inpatient treatment. I ended up in Ward 17, a PTSD facility in Melbourne for veterans and first responders. Just before that admission, someone suggested I look into moral injury. I'd never heard of moral injury, but when I read about it, I knew immediately that it applied to me. This book, my memoir, which took 7 years to write, is partly about how I came to understand my moral injury. So who was familiar with moral injury before hearing about this presentation? I'm happy for people to hit the react button if they want. I'm not sure if that works in this particular format, but if it does, go ahead and hit that button. Moral injury has long been understood in military circles. There has also been growing interest for years in Australian first responder communities, healthcare, mental health, the social assistance industry, teaching and other frontline occupations. Now, this interest is surging since moral injury was recognised in an update to the DSM-5 in September. I'll talk more about that in later slides. I hope people will take one or more of the following three things away from this presentation. One, an understanding of moral injury, if it's something you've never heard about before or it's something you don't know much about. Two, an appreciation of why you need to factor moral injury into the management of psychosocial hazards in your workplace, if that's relevant for you. And 3, if you're a healthcare professional, how you might use what you hear today to better understand clients who might be suffering from moral injury. Moral injury is an evolving concept. There's a lot of academic research and debate going into the topic. Essentially, moral injury is a wound to the soul. It's a condition that shatters people's sense of self, their identity, their views of others, and sometimes the world. It's akin to PTSD, but it's a distinct affliction that can occur in any occupation in any walk of life. Transgressions of the self, others, or organizations or institutions that may reach the threshold to be a moral injury are referred to as potentially morally injurious events. Similar to a traumatic event, which doesn't necessarily lead to PTSD, likewise with moral injury. Many people exposed to a potentially traumatic, morally traumatic event will experience distress that resolves on its own, subsequently avoiding the severity of a moral injury. Now, moral injury is characterized by significant psychological, emotional, and spiritual suffering, and significant functional impairment. Research shows frontline workers with moral injury have an increased risk of suicidal behavior, while there is also a strong association between moral injury and PTSD. The term moral injury was coined by an American psychiatrist called Jonathan Shea in the mid-1990s after he'd spent years treating Vietnam War veterans with severe PTSD. It's not that Shea didn't think his patients had PTSD, but what he observed was something beyond the well-known combat scenarios of life threat and fear. It was an indignant rage in men betrayed by their commanders in Vietnam and when they got home. He believed veterans could usually recover from the horror, fear, and grief of war if their notion of what's right hadn't been violated. Shea settled on the definition of moral injury as the betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority, for example, a military superior in a high-stakes situation. Now, moral injury remained a fringe concept until clinicians and researchers led by Brett Litz, a professor in the departments of psychiatry and psychology at Boston University, published an academic paper in 2009 that defined a second form among US veterans: perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. We'll come to what's happening with the DSM-5 in a later slide. Moral injury first went mainstream when COVID-19 swept the world because it perfectly captured the dilemma for overwhelmed hospital staff. Who got a bed? Who got ventilated? Telling stricken families a loved one would die alone. Moral injury encapsulated the fury at hospital administrators and authorities for failing to provide enough personal protective equipment, at safety guidelines that contravened individual ethics. More recently, New South Wales psychiatrists have said they are suffering moral injury because they have been working in a failing public mental health system where they cannot give adequate care to people who are severely unwell. This is a wordy slide, but I want people to understand just how widespread the risk is. Where I refer to evidence in this slide, this is based on multiple studies. Emerging evidence means there might be one study or the research base is not very strong. While there is no research available, I suspect people in that last cohort are vulnerable to moral injury. Now, the notion of evidence and emerging evidence says very little about what's actually going on. It really just speaks to who has received funding to study what. Areas in which research are underfunded will receive less attention, not because moral injury doesn't exist in those cohorts, but because scholars in those fields haven't gotten the funding to do the research. So what does the data tell us? While strong data on prevalence rates for moral injury has not caught up with interest in the subject, 2 nationally representative US studies published in 2025, so this year, on high-risk groups have helped establish a preliminary baseline for outcomes. Those studies are the ones that I've highlighted in yellow and green there. The first study was of 1,200 combat veterans, healthcare workers, and first responders conducted during COVID. Roughly half the veterans, healthcare workers, and first responders endorsed exposure to a potentially morally injurious event. Remember from an earlier slide, transgressions of the self, others, or organizations, institutions that may reach the threshold to be a moral injury are referred to as potentially morally injurious events. Of these people who endorsed exposure to a potentially morally injurious event, 14.4% of healthcare workers, 13.1% of veterans, and 9.8% of first responders screened positive for moral injury. So these percentages are of people who endorsed exposure to a potentially morally injurious event. If you looked at the total sample, the percentages who screened positive for moral injury would roughly halve. What was very concerning was that those who screened positive for moral injury had 6 times greater odds of attempting suicide in their lifetime than those who did not. And they were 3 times more likely to have thought of suicide in the last 2 weeks. A larger study of just over 3,000 US veterans showed 44.7% endorsed potentially morally injurious events, with the weighted prevalence of moral injury among this group at 13.1%. Yes, that's the same percentage of veterans as in the first study. Now, you will see those studies highlighted in blue. Those were frontline healthcare workers assessed for moral injury during COVID. The prevalence of clinically significant moral injury in one study of US healthcare workers was 32.4%, with nurses reporting the highest occurrence. The estimated prevalence in China was 41.3% and nearly 41% in frontline Israeli healthcare workers. Those are big percentages, though the authors reported numerous limitations to those studies, so they should be treated with caution. Okay, I'm going to give examples of moral injury through my own story. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, 2 of my staff were killed in Baghdad in a US helicopter attack on July 12, 2007. What you see on the screen is a still image from the footage of that attack, taken from the gun camera on the Apache helicopter. That footage became infamous in 2010 when Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published it. Julian called the footage collateral murder. Many of you are probably familiar with the tape. I was the Reuters bureau chief. I was responsible for everyone's safety. Yes, it was a war zone, but 2 men died on my watch. I believe I could have done more to prevent those deaths. I transgressed my moral code by failing to prevent the deaths of my Iraqi staff. I held myself responsible. When I read about moral injury in 2016, it all fell into place. Other elements of my moral injury involve my failure to act, such as demanding my employer, Reuters, call for an independent investigation into what happened. The key word here was failure to act according to my values, transgression of my ethical code. Now, a lot of organizations recognize long service leave among their staff. I got this memento for my 25 years of service at Reuters. Sometime before I got that service recognition, Reuters tried to throw me on the journalist scrap heap, force me out of the organization. They did that just a few weeks after my first psych ward admission. Now, I had 3 admissions over 2 years. Before that first admission, I had told Reuters that I couldn't do journalism because of my PTSD. A psychiatrist in Tasmania who had diagnosed me months earlier with PTSD had told me the stress would be too much, but I also knew it in my heart. Before that first psych ward admission, the Reuters Asia editor had agreed to my proposal to create a training role that I would do when I was well enough to return to work. But someone decided after my first psych ward admission that I was damaged goods. The promised new role was withdrawn. No other role existed because I was working remotely in Evandale, near Launceston. The company tried to force me into the workers' comp system. Reuters did this knowing I'd just gotten out of a psych ward, that I'd been admitted in the first place because I had been suicidal. They did this despite everything I had done as a journalist, bureau chief, and news editor. I had risked my life on countless occasions, seen death on an unimaginable scale. This attempt to force me out was eventually dropped, and I was made the Reuters head of journalist mental health and well-being several months later. Nevertheless, I suffered a moral injury because of this, and it was harder to deal with than anything I experienced in the field, even the deaths of my Iraqi staff. So I'm going to explain what a potentially morally injurious event could look like for multiple people. Now, remember, transgressions that may reach the threshold to be a moral injury are called potentially morally injurious events. A few years ago, a young journalist emailed me, wanted to know if she had moral injury. Her job at a major Australian media organisation had been to edit videos for social media of all the flooding that was happening in northern New South Wales. She had been having nightmares. We spoke on Zoom. There were tears in her eyes for most of our conversation. What she was witnessing was breaking her heart. So, first responders, they might have to make decisions affecting who survives an event like this, how long people are left waiting. Mental health service providers, witnessing the distress in the community for months and years later, the failure of systems to provide support needed for people to get back on their feet. Local councils, engineers. I spoke to a meeting of local New South Wales engineers a couple of years ago. There was distress among folks from northern New South Wales at the impact from this flooding and their inability to respond in ways that aligned with their values. And of course, the victims, the residents who survived this catastrophic event. They might have had no insurance, lost their homes, businesses, felt betrayed by government action on the climate crisis, government action over previous disasters, or the slowness of local and state government to respond. This might already be on your mind, but as we go along, think about the potential for morally injurious events in your workplace. It's important that we speak about potentially morally injurious events. As I said before, like a traumatic event doesn't automatically lead to PTSD. It's the same with moral injury. The event needs to be significant. So this was big news. But the first thing to say is that moral injury has not been classified as a mental illness. But moral injury being recognized in the DSM-5 was definitely big news. The American Psychiatric Association, the APA, which publishes the DSM, made this change last month to add and connect moral problems to the religious or spiritual problem category, which on a proposed spectrum of severity go from moral dilemmas to moral distress to moral injury. This revision occurs under what are called Z codes, and TR stands for text revision. Now, Z codes help clinicians document and understand the broader context of a patient's mental health, including environmental factors, recent stresses that may be affecting their condition. Z codes are not diagnoses themselves. They are meant to draw attention to the scope of additional issues that may be encountered in routine clinical practice. They provide context, additional information that may require attention or consideration in how a mental health condition is treated. I'll give you an example. Treatment-resistant clients with PTSD have been known to drastically improve when moral injury was addressed, says Dr. Nikki Jamieson, one of Australia's leading moral injury clinicians and researchers. So it's possible to see how the description of moral problems there on the screen could apply to our earlier definition of moral injury when the symptoms are severe enough. And that definition I had up on the screen earlier was the lasting harm someone can suffer from transgressions of others when they deeply violate their own ethical code, feel utterly betrayed by an organization, government, or system, or witnessing horror. This change to the DSM-5 came after more than a dozen US and Australian researchers and clinicians made a formal submission to the APA to have moral injury included in the DSM-5. The APA has not defined moral injury, by the way. My thoughts and a summary of what other experts have said. This change means validation for sufferers. It's recognition. Moral injury is now valid in clinical settings, and clinicians have a framework. They've got language to use. Moral injury is being acknowledged as a significant factor that warrants attention and consideration in addition to or alongside related disorders. This will take moral injury mainstream, and it's going to pave the way for more research. It's going to unlock funding for more research. I suspect this also puts pressure on employers. regulators, and insurers because it's now been recognized in the so-called Bible of mental illness. Some people have said that this makes moral injury a clinical problem when moral issue shouldn't be seen as such, and that the DSM-5 is not the right place for it, or that this puts the burden on the individual. I understand why some people will question moral injury's recognition in the DSM-5, perhaps seeing it as too much of a clinical platform. But I think for some people suffering moral injury, it does become a clinical problem. It certainly was for me. And so its inclusion in the DSM-5 can open the way for treatment options. Some experts have said it's important not to pathologize moral challenges and stresses that are part of the human condition. But moral injury as a clinical problem has emerged from recognition that PTSD has failed to fully account for exposure to morally injurious events. In addition, evidence-based therapies for PTSD may fall short in addressing moral injury. So this recognition validates moral injury in clinical settings. I don't think the benefit of that can be underestimated. So obviously, we've been speaking about PTSD. So moral injury and PTSD can coexist. You can have one and not the other, but it does get tricky trying to disentangle them, work out the right treatments. The definition of PTSD can be limiting for some. What do I mean by that? The DSM-5 says trauma must involve real or threatened death, severe injury, or sexual assault such as rape to be called PTSD. This can be limiting because it's built around life threat and fear. I don't think this always captures the moral dimension of trauma. Okay, so my own experience. I covered the Bali bombings, which is where that photo was taken. This messed me up psychologically for nearly 20 years. 202 people were killed, including 88 Australians. I interviewed multiple survivors, so I experienced repeated exposure to details of that traumatic event, which fits a criterion A event, which is needed for a PTSD diagnosis. But for me, it was two things that got me. One, the evilness of that event. I felt it in the air. I could touch it. Secondly, while I did interview multiple survivors at the bomb site and elsewhere, I could not walk into the Denpasar hospital where all the wounded had been taken, including scores of Australians. I froze outside the hospital. I failed to do my job. The Bali bombings in 2002 was the biggest story I had covered at that point in my life, but I let my colleagues down. The other thing that PTSD absolutely doesn't capture is organizational and institutional betrayal. PTSD can sometimes be the first trauma. The moral injury comes later. All the men and women I met in the Ward 17 psych unit, veterans and first responders, were there for PTSD, for occupational trauma. But it was the potentially morally injurious experiences that were doing the damage when I met them, being abandoned by their organizations, their battles with DVA and with workers' comp. Because moral injury is still an emerging condition, there is much debate around definitions, how to measure it. But this is an excellent slide on the proposed criteria for moral injury and the symptom overlap with PTSD, which was developed by the consortium that got moral injury recognized in the DSM. I really like this slide, and I just want to highlight a few things. So, as I said, PTSD needs a criterion A event, severe trauma, life threat, serious violence, sexual assault. Now, moral injury does not need life threat or fear according to all experts, not just this consortium. The criterion A event for moral injury is acknowledgement of the transgression on your moral values and the resulting significant distress or impairment. You can see that on the slide there where it points up to the left, criterion A. Secondly, PTSD fails to recognize organizational or system betrayal. Moral injury does, hence the proposed criteria, betrayal. Third, guilt, shame, and anger. You can see these under the proposed moral injury criteria. These are the big symptoms according to all the experts, all the research I've seen. It's not that guilt and shame are not part of PTSD, but they are overwhelming in moral injury. Guilt and shame with moral injury are largely when you transgress your own values, and it's anger and rage when it's betrayal. Now, the big overlap between PTSD and moral injury is with cognitions and mood. numbing, withdrawal from others, depression, self-medicating to cope, enduring negative changes in beliefs about self, others, and the world. This is often experienced in relation to an organization or system. And this is where the two conditions can get confusing under this system cluster. And you can see how that's where there is that major overlap there. How do moral injury and PTSD differ in a nutshell? PTSD results in a racing heart, moral injury in a broken heart. That is my spiritual care worker at Ward 17, Kath Taylor, who helped me forgive myself over the deaths of my Iraqi staff. The pain is written on my face, while the empathy and understanding is written on Kath's. I just want to inject a little bit of caution into this presentation as we go along. One of the challenges with moral injury as knowledge of the condition grows, and now that it's been recognized in the DSM-5, is to ensure it doesn't become a catch-all way to describe the range of moral emotions people experience in relation to events in their personal lives, the workplace, with authorities, and the wider world. People will be impacted to different degrees by an event that has moral implications for them. It's the same with traumatic events and PTSD. The impact can vary depending on an individual's personal history, for example. In this hypothesized continuum model of moral stresses and outcomes, it shows the continuum of morally relevant life experiences. Now, moral challenges, for example, which are up on the top left of the screen there, are part of daily life, very common, and may lead to fleeting, normal feelings of moral frustration. Then there are the range of mid-severity moral stresses that might occasionally or even periodically cause moral distress. The dividing line between moral distress and moral injury is the severity of functional impact and the symptoms and their persistence. Much like the distinction between acute stress disorder and PTSD, moral distress can be considered the short-term reaction to potentially morally injurious experiences. I just wanted to point this out because while moral injury is going mainstream, we don't have a lot of large-scale studies on moral injury prevalence. What we do have are pockets of worrying data across high-risk roles, and you'll see an example of that with Australian police shortly. And at the same time, some workers in some sectors are starting to perceive moral injury as a significant threat to their well-being. Let's take a look at moral injury in some sectors, starting with healthcare workers. I suspect that might be relevant for some people on this call. If we look at the research, healthcare workers are among the most at-risk occupations in the world to moral injury, frequently facing moral dilemmas in decision-making on top of the trauma and suffering they witness. Now, research shows healthcare workers are increasingly exposed to avoidable moral conflicts because of organizational and systemic decisions. This is especially the case where a focus on the bottom line or government funding in Australia compromises care, resulting in healthcare workers being unable to provide safe, optimal, or even adequate care. The comment from the New South Wales psychiatrist says it all. To tell someone who is acutely suicidal that I cannot offer them a bed and to discharge them to completely depleted community services has caused me to experience a moral injury. In June, the Productivity Commission issued an interim report on the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement, which sets out the shared intention of the Commonwealth, state and territory governments to work in partnership to improve the mental health of all Australians. The report was scathing, saying the agreement is not fit for purpose. The mental health and suicide prevention system is fragmented and out of reach for many, it added. That, to me, is a recipe for potentially morally injurious experiences for people who work in that system and for those who seek care in it. This was a fascinating survey of 229 Australian first responders conducted by the Reverend Mark Layson, an expert in moral injury. It was published in 2023. More than one-third felt betrayed more than 50 times during their career. Now, Mark used the words moral suffering to encompass moral injury and moral distress. What is striking is how betrayal causes a far greater increase in moral suffering than the trauma experienced in the field. This is in line with what every first responder I have spoken to has told me over the past decade. After that last slide, it's not surprising to see these high rates of moral injury in police, although witnessing moral transgressions by others was higher than organizational betrayal. Now, this was a small survey, but leading academics carried it out, including Professor Lindsay Carey, who was part of that consortium that got moral injury recognized in the DSM. These were quite alarming, these results, and it used one of the most validated moral injury scales in the world to get the results. A small survey of lived experience peer workers in Queensland published last year showed respondents ranked moral injury or values clash as the biggest psychosocial hazard in the workplace, impacting most on their health and well-being. Next were lack of role clarity and vicarious trauma. Now, we don't know if those workers had moral injury. They were not asked about potentially morally injurious experiences or assessed for symptoms of the condition using any outcome scales, but it shows that this workforce is acutely aware moral injury exists and can relate it to the psychosocial hazards in the helping sector. Before we talk about reducing the risk of moral injury, I just want to draw your attention to the association between moral injury and suicide. In that first study, that first US study I mentioned of 1,200 combat veterans, healthcare workers, and first responders, roughly half endorsed exposure to a potentially morally injurious event. Of those, 10 to 14% screened positive for moral injury, and those who screened positive had 6 times greater odds of attempting suicide in their lifetime than those who did not, and were 3 times more likely to have thought of suicide in the last 2 weeks. This was the first study to examine the unique associations of moral injury and mental health symptoms with suicidal ideation and suicide attempts among individuals in high-stress military and civilian occupations. Among those who screened positive for moral injury, nearly 2/3 endorsed thinking about suicide, and 40% reported an attempt in their lifetime. So interventions to mitigate moral injury in the workplace are nascent, and what follows draws from existing research. I just want to go back to our example from the flooding in northern New South Wales. Underpinning it, when we talk about reducing the risk of moral injury in the workplace, underpinning everything is moral leadership and a moral organizational culture. Firstly, it's important to normalize the conversation around moral challenges, especially in frontline occupation. Organizational leaders can't control all the trauma first responders encounter on the streets. They can't stop trauma presenting at the ED. We can't stop natural disasters. In fact, they're going to get worse. But instead of saying nothing, offering false expectations, or binding workers to rigid codes of conduct, organizational leaders need to acknowledge and encourage the discussion of morally challenging situations, such as tragic dilemmas, lapses in judgment, or the powerlessness in the face of Mother Nature, or injustice, or system constraints. A whole array of workers across multiple sectors need to feel that they can discuss what's coming when it comes to the moral challenge of their role in responding to the climate emergency. The second thing is the implementation of what are called just cultures. This recognizes that mistakes often stem from systemic flaws rather than individual failings. So the emphasis shifts from assigning blame to understanding what went wrong. While accountability for misconduct remains important, a just culture prioritizes restorative justice over retributive justice. The third thing are clear policies, procedures around ethical conduct, and ensuring workers can speak up without fear or recrimination. So an example of this could be for any teams that are sent out to provide help, to provide support to people affected by flooding or bushfires. Frank briefings on what to expect and what are the expectations from management. The fourth thing, ethics training for all staff. Number 5, visible management support for worker welfare, especially in times of high stress. The authors of a study that found 39% of 2,000 frontline healthcare workers in US Veterans Affairs clinical settings were at risk for moral injury, said worker perception of how much management was concerned about their health and safety was highly predictive of moral injury, above and beyond all other identified risk factors. Finally, put ethical considerations at the heart of funding essential public services. I think we need honest conversations about the climate emergency and how we respond at all levels of government. So I've just written these into a slide just to make it a little bit easier for people to see. And just as I said, political leaders and governments need to understand the potentially morally injurious events being created for an array of workers, from healthcare to public servants, when essential services and policies are poorly funded, badly designed, or illegal and cruel, as we saw with robo-debt. If we're talking about a bit more specifically for frontline workers, firstly, it's important to recognize that moral injury doesn't automatically follow exposure to potentially morally injurious events, but many frontline workers will be exposed. You've seen the data. Therefore, moral injury needs to be framed as a predictable occupational exposure in frontline workers. Now, no organization in Australia, not a single one, has a wellbeing strategy to address moral suffering, according to that 2023 research by the Reverend Mark Layson. The points about healthcare workers are common sense, but interestingly, they are backed up by research, and I suspect they would have applicability across frontline organizations, not just healthcare. So bring the management of potentially morally injurious events in line with other psychosocial hazards. And now you've got the DSM-5 recognition as an added reason to do this. And also, to reduce the risk of moral injury, staff need to be heard. They need to be allowed to speak out. Remember why people do frontline work. They are values driven, and they need to be protected for speaking out. When we talk about healing from moral injury, we need to assess what has been damaged. This is your starting point. Beyond the psychological symptoms, the inability to function, we are talking about a loss of identity, a loss of sense of self, being valued by others, being valued by the group, i.e. your organization. Now, research suggests that some PTSD treatments might be helpful. And as I said earlier, treatment of resistant clients with PTSD have been known to drastically improve when moral injury was addressed as part of their treatment approach, according to Dr. Nikki Jamieson, one of Australia's leading moral injury clinicians and researchers. Recall the slide I showed on the high rates of moral injury among Australian and New Zealand police. That research showed that police rated chaplain support the highest among the various support options. It may be due to the alignment between the support police indicated they wanted, feelings validated, seeking to reconcile their experience, and the support chaplains provide. A modality called pastoral narrative disclosure therapy has been developed for Australian chaplains to address moral injury in veterans. This may prove valuable for other chaplains working in community health or first responder context. But that military survey that I've got on the screen there, I think was very interesting. It involved nearly 3,000 soldiers. What I think it shows is that staff need to be offered a range of support options. So what worked for me? Healing from the deaths of my Iraqi staff was a multidisciplinary process. I believed I was culpable over their deaths, and I found a team willing to help me through that. That team at various times comprised psychologists, a psychiatrist, mental health nurses, and of course my spiritual care worker, Kath. I utilized elements of adaptive disclosure, which is a treatment designed for US veterans, which revolves around accepting responsibility, forgiveness, making amends, showing yourself self-compassion, and finding meaning in life. This culminated in a memorial service on the 10th anniversary of the deaths of my Iraqi staff at a hospital chapel near the Ward 17 psych unit. This was during my second psych ward admission. I went into that service seeking the forgiveness of my staff for not protecting them. Part of this involved writing them a 5,000-word letter, which I read aloud at that service. Kath didn't tell me this, but she planned the service so that I'd forgive myself. That's exactly what happened. It illustrated the power of ritual. As for the Reuters betrayal, there was no apology, no accountability. I found my own ways to move on from that, partly by writing my memoir. When I did need help from someone at Reuters a few years ago, I got it unexpectedly from the company president, someone I never met, who was not with the organization when I worked there. It was an act of kindness that meant a lot to me. Despite all the challenges that we face with moral injury, I think it's vitally important that we understand the moral dimension of trauma, to understand that there are people suffering moral injury who don't know what it is. They don't know what to call it. Many of these people are in the workplace. They need our help. They need our support. Now we have this recognition in the DSM-5, so it's really an opportunity to be able to advance that conversation. But we do have some challenges. There is still no gold standard definition around moral injury. There's a bunch of different scales out there that are being used to measure moral injury. It's not clear what scales clinicians should use. Hopefully at some point, Safe Work Australia will recognise moral injury. And I don't have the time to talk about the workers' comp system, but there's issues around that as well. But I think the fact that we've got this recognition now really has set us on a path to advancing our understanding of moral injury and looking at it in as a psychosocial hazard in the workplace. All right. I am very happy to answer any questions, Sonia, that we might have there. So why don't we do that?
Yes, thank you so much, Dean. I think we've got a few questions already in the chat. I might just read the first one out to you, which says, since moral injury is classed under the Z codes, how do you think it will impact on insurance claims, including CTP, which require a recognized clinical diagnosis?
Yeah, look, I think it's a bit too early to say how it might be seen in the insurance context, because moral injury is not being classified as a mental illness per se. It's not like it's being classified as like PTSD as a mental illness, and so I think it's just going to take a little bit of time for us to see how it actually works out in practice in the occupational space. Now that we have this recognition, I'm not entirely sure how things work with Z codes in the insurance side. It might just mean that we need to build up a little bit of time and see if there's any sort of industry, if we get any sort of industry agreement about what this does mean, and but hopefully, I'm hopeful that it will be recognised.
Thank you, Dean. We've got a question saying, "Oh my goodness, thank you, Dean, for this, for bringing light to moral injury. Does this mean that we potentially have a generation of children exposed to moral injury, children who are told to speak up when adults cause them harm, but then the systems fail to act when the child does speak up, particularly when children are forced by way of family court orders to return for access stays with the parent where they are unsafe, where there has been a history of family violence?"
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think a lot of the moral injury research so far is sort of taken place in the military settings, first responder settings, occupational settings. But I know there are some folks out there who really want to get into this sort of context around how it affects children and how it has affected children. And so I think there is certainly the potential for people who have gone through very traumatic experiences, adverse childhood experiences, to have been exposed to events that may potentially have caused them to suffer moral injury. And I think we can all think of the potential examples around that. We've only got to look at some of the royal commissions we've had into child sexual abuse and so on to see where that might have been possible. And I suspect that this might actually help give people language to understand where they have been suffering from various traumas, that maybe moral injury will help give them extra language to be able to help identify what it is they've been suffering from.
Thank you so much for that, Dean. I think the next question is in few parts, so bear with me. It says, looking to progress change using the current regulatory context and business risk appetite, could the link to current legal context, which does have PCBU attention, including codes of practice, be via clustering as per the ComCare COP? And sorry,
Yeah,
Dean.
I honestly, I am not sure about that. I just don't have enough visibility on that. But what I think is interesting in the current legal context is that, so my thinking on where moral injury might stand in the legal sense was that unless it's a recognized mental illness, then it's a worker might not have much chance in a court of law, for example, if they felt that if they had suffered a moral injury in the workplace and then they wanted to take action against their employer. But interestingly, a couple of months ago, an academic out of Bonn University wrote a very interesting paper where she argued that where there is a known hazard in the workplace, and if that hazard is obvious, then an employer is under common law is on notice that a particular hazard might be likely to cause someone a psychological injury. Now, this academic argued that you could argue that moral injury is a known hazard in certain frontline occupations. So I think in that sense, there's clearly now discussion in the legal sphere that moral injury does need to be taken into account. No one's tested it. No one's tried this out. So that would always, that's going to have to, that would be, I think, the next step where you'd see someone actually take a case to court and sue an employer to see if that actually worked. What would obviously help someone in this situation would be if moral injury was recognised as a harm in the Safe Work Australia regulations and codes of practice, which it currently is not.
Thanks, Dean. The next one says, just as PTSD can be cumulative, can moral injury also be cumulative in that
Yes.
sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that in some of these frontline occupations, actually, it's more likely that the moral injury is going to be cumulative. In my case, obviously, the deaths of my staff was a big bang moral injury event. But you might find for healthcare workers, for first responders, for example, they are going to be subject to a significant number of potentially morally injurious events that are likely to accumulate over time, just like it can happen with PTSD.
Thanks for that, Dean. The next one says, I work in the pastoral care team of a large community services organization. Do you think noble or values-based professions are at more risk for moral injury, particularly around sense of betrayal? And how can leaders take responsibility for such betrayals without lapsing into individual blame?
Yeah, I think one of the important things about understanding with moral injury is that if you are suffering from moral injury, it's actually a sign of an intact conscience, right? It actually is a sign that your conscience is intact. Psychopaths don't suffer from moral injury. Sociopaths don't suffer from moral injury. So for that very reason, people who do work in organizations that have very strong values, I think, are going to be susceptible to potentially morally injurious events, because if they are values driven, and this is why there's a lot of interest in moral injury in frontline occupations, right, where people are very much driven by their values, and I think this is why those sorts of people are very vulnerable to betrayal, because they go to work in these sorts of organizations they're not looking to earn big money. They're not looking for prestige and power. They want to make a difference. And when people like that who are values driven come up against an organization that, for whatever reason, transgresses their values, that betrayal is so much more significant than, say, it would be for someone who doesn't share those same values, especially when that's the result of poor leadership, and them and those people who are, if they're unable to bring about the change that they feel is required and they're forced to leave, it can be doubly worse.
Thanks again, Dean. Just a quick acknowledgement. Thank you all for sending your questions through, and we've got a great, tremendous response, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So I'll just read out the next one, which says, can moral injury also be vicarious, for instance, dealing with many folk who have been betrayed by the organization?
Well, it's a good question. Can you just put that up on the screen? Yeah, thanks, Sonia. Yes, I think it can be, because it's all about, it can be about your experiences and it's about the witnessing. It can be about witnessing the transgressions against others. Often, obviously, with the word vicarious, we think of vicarious trauma, and so I think this is where there can be some confusion. But I think it depends on the context. So if you are working in a community service organization, you're working as a social worker, or that's sort of in that help sector, and you are dealing with people who have been betrayed or have suffered some sort of betrayal, then yes, you could be vulnerable, because you will be hearing a lot of these stories, and you will be seeing and witnessing and absorbing a lot of that systemic betrayal that is taking place.
Thank you for that. The next one says, do you think it may take a couple of big employment law cases / class actions for moral injury to be recognized in workers' comp?
Yeah, I think the first step is getting Safe Work Australia to recognise. So getting Safe Work Australia to recognise moral injury as a harm, and getting Safe Work Australia to recognise potentially morally injurious events as the psychosocial hazard, I think is the first step. Then I think it will be there. Yeah, there might then maybe a legal precedent would be important to set the stage. One of the first things that might actually happen is, we obviously had the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide last year, where moral injury was a word that was used a lot, and it came up. It was very clearly an issue, for veterans, and so there might be developments out of that Royal Commission that result in some sorts of changes or compensation, perhaps. And it actually might be that Royal Commission in Defence and Veteran Suicide that proves to be a bit of a test case when it comes to the compensation side of things, because that Royal Commission was really the first time that moral injury had been discussed in any sort of public inquiry in Australia. So I think we need to see what happens a little bit more there.
Thank you, Dean. The next one is a feedback and a question, and the attendee says the words feel inadequate to express their gratefulness towards the presentation. And it says, I have my own experience of MI as a victim of ruinous white-collar crime and institutional betrayal, extending to my efforts to push for meaningful accountability, reform, and redress. This is crucial work you and the others are doing. And they're asking if they can grab a copy of your slides.
That's over to you, Sonia. I'm very happy for my slides to be passed on. That's absolutely fine. But it's a good point that person makes about white-collar crime and white-collar issues around moral injury and white-collar context, because at the moment, a lot of the research and a lot of the focus is on frontline organizations. So first responder organizations, healthcare, teaching, journalism, corrections, and so on. There's a little pockets of research into the potential for moral injury in corporate settings. And it's because of the profit, the drive for profits over people, the willingness to cut corners, the willingness to ignore compliance and other aspects of the corporate sector, that I think really make this whole topic very applicable to the corporate world and white collar sector in general. So great. I appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're more than happy to forward the slides through. And just a reminder that this session is recorded, so feel free to tune back to our YouTube channel to just go through the session again. There was another comment which mentioned where they could find and buy your book, Dean, in Launceston.
Petrarch's. The wonderful Petrarch's bookshop. Well, if they don't have a copy, they'll certainly be able to get you one. I guarantee it.
Lovely, thank you for that. Alrighty, the next one, and this might be a few of our last ones. Would concrete avenues to recognize conscientious objection in the workplace, for example, in the case of mandatory vaccination, go some way to mitigating the risk of workplace compensation claims for moral injury? How do we achieve that in a politically loaded social climate?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, to be honest, Sonia.
We can jump on to the next one, Dean.
Yeah, maybe just jump onto the next one. Yeah. I would just, I can see a question there. Can you please provide the paper on moral injury from Bond University? I will say, Wendy, gosh, what's her last name? Maybe I can provide it to you, Sonia, and you can pass it along to the respondents.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
we
sure.
Definitely do that. Alrighty, so the next one is the not so new now WHO development to consider burnout and occupational phenomena also an avenue that could help with change?
Yeah, so burnout is obviously, there is some differences with moral injury and burnout, and I think burnout is burnout refers to that deep exhaustion that people will feel, that occupational exhaustion that people will feel, which sometimes has been put on the individual, as opposed to where it's obviously there is an organizational context to it. I think where it can get a bit confusing for people, but what is really the difference here is that when you talk about burnout and moral injury is that deeper transgression of values and the contravention of someone's moral compass. And so I think that while they are separate, it does help to keep burnout in the context as well when we are talking about moral injury.
Thank you for that, Dean. And we've got one last question. I think it's a great one. It says, it's such a big and important space. If an organization is just starting to think about how to support their people and prevent moral injury, where do you recommend we start? And I think it aligns really well with what you mentioned earlier, Dean, when you said to heal, you need to assess what's been damaged. And if you could maybe just shed some more light on that.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I think that shows a really nice curiosity from that question and within that organization. So within that curiosity, I think the first thing to be doing is to be creating a safe space for people to actually talk about morally challenging situations in that workplace, because we face them all the time. And especially if we're talking about frontline roles, there are so many different morally challenging situations that people will encounter, but a lot of times people are too afraid to ask questions, or they're too afraid to bring them up. And so if you can create a safe space where it's okay for people to feel comfortable and safe to have those sorts of discussions, that I think is your first step towards addressing moral injury, where you create a safe space for this to be discussed and allow people to start to build confidence around how they deal with the sorts of morally challenging situations that they're going to confront in all aspects of their work, internally and externally, no matter what the situation they're confronted with. That's a great start.
Thank you so much, Dean. And I think this might just bring us towards the end. I really, really wanted to say a big thank you for shedding light on such an important issue that often goes unspoken. and the lasting impact that people experience when their values are compromised at work. And the comments that have come through will echo the level of knowledge that you have and the wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us. And we've got a lot of takeaways.
Now, you're welcome, Sonia. Thank you very much for organising this webinar. I was delighted to be here.
Thank you, Dean. Just wanted to quickly mention that this event is run as part of the WorkSafe Tasmania month. So please go to worksafe.tas.gov.au/month to find out what else we have in store. There will also be a survey link towards the end of the session. So we'd love to hear your feedback. And thank you again for attending today's webinar, everyone. Have a great rest of the day and stay safe. Thank you again, Dean.
Okay, thank you. Bye. Bye.